Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 25, The New Deal. This chapter deals with Franklin D. Roosevelt's plan to offer some relief to struggling Americans during the Great Depression. So we know the stock market crashed, but there were more causes than that of the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 was really just the most visible of the problems. The bigger problem was that Americans had adjusted to a new normal of sorts. In the 1920s, investors were sinking money left and right into these new markets for consumer goods like automobiles, radios, refrigerators, that sort of thing. And they convinced foreign investors to also sink money into the production of these things. The government was pouring billions into roads and bridges in preparation for more auto use. Building, especially steel, boomed, and people began to normalize this. This boom to them was the new normal. Instead of looking at it as a good economic time, they saw it as this is how it's going to be forever. So this new normal created kind of a false sense of security that really took people off guard with the stock market crash. It created instability of international economy at a time when international economy was also struggling. Another cause of the Great Depression was that the push to invest in America after World War I finally started losing steam. After World War I, people were interested in promoting the economy, getting back on track, getting the United States back to where it wanted to be economically. But after some time, this is, a good decade has passed, people are starting to lose interest at this point. So they've stopped investing, which is another cause of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, foreign commerce slowed. England and France still owed the United States a big war debt, and they needed to trade with us to help pay it off. But the U.S. raised tariffs, which made that harder for the people who owed us money. Then the banks stopped issuing credit. The human toll was of disastrous proportions. People lost everything from jobs to their homes. Whole families were out on the streets suddenly without warning. This photograph shows a man who's trying to make money by selling apples. You can see his sign says unemployed, and he's selling apples for 5 cents each. The Great Crash and the Great Depression affected everyone, middle class, working class alike. The Depression's universality made it exceptionally potent as a political force. This picture shows a gentleman trying to make some money by selling apples for 5 cents each. The Great Crash and the Great Depression spared neither the working class nor middle class people, though clearly the African Americans suffered even more. In most cases, they were the first to lose their jobs. They were discriminated against in favor of white employees. So if it meant firing an African American so a white person could keep their job, that's what happened most of the time. Then, to make matters worse, they were turned down oftentimes in relief efforts. Like in Houston, they were turned down by officials in relief efforts, as far as unemployment benefits or housing benefits, that sort of thing. And then to top it all off, Klan-like sentiments revived during this period, pushing for jobs for whites. Women were also affected by the joblessness of the Great Depression, but in a little different way. First of all, in terms of families, divorce actually declined because, people couldn't afford to separate anymore. It cost too much to live separately. So they pooled their resources and simply stayed together. Birth rates also declined because children were just another hungry mouth to feed. So we have smaller families starting to develop at this time. The men during this time period were still considered the breadwinners of the family, and some employers actually discouraged women from working so that men could have those jobs so that they could use them to take care of their families. Despite this, though, more women started joining the labor market, and part of that is because other employers realized that they could get women to work cheaper than men. So, in a way, kind of started working out for women, getting them into the workforce. Despite the obvious despair of the times, life still had to go on. People still worked and they still tried to support their families. And on a fun note, a miniature golf craze took off in the winter of 1929 to 1930. And radio stars start developing. Gosden and Correll, both whites, who portrayed African American characters Amos and Andy through then comical stereotypes. These stereotypes today we would consider offensive. So, but then it was considered comical. Also, we had pop music from jazz great Duke Ellington, and Benny Goodman invented this new style of music called the swing. Herbert Hoover was president at the time of the Great Crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. He's received a lot of criticism over the years, including back then, current day, because his reaction was slow. He didn't seem to offer much help to people who were struggling. By today's perspective, certainly it was slow, but we have to remember that it took time then to assess the damage. And back then, the typical assessment of a government's role was that it should play a limited role in a financial crisis. So here's a huge financial crisis, and the President Hoover, is faced with what to do. So he basically took this approach of giving pep talks to the citizens of the country, reminding them to hang in there and it would get better soon enough. Finally, in late 1931, Hoover decided he needed to do something to help the domestic economy, the economy right here at home. So he helped to restore the international economy with a moratorium on German reparations and Ally war debts. Then he created, through Congress, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which started in 1932 to give loans to failing banks, railroads, industrial firms, and savings and loan institutions. The idea was that that money would help banks and savings and loan institutions to become solid, but also to give money to the railroads, industrial firms, to help them keep offering jobs to people, to get people to continue working. So those couple of things that Hoover did just were not enough to give any kind of relief at all to Americans who were suffering tremendously. Something called Hoovervilles began springing up, and these are these little shanty towns on the outskirts of cities. The photograph below shows one. It's small on your slide, but it's actually in an alleyway in a town. You can see that pieces of board have just been shoved up together to create some sort of makeshift shelter, and whole families were living this way. Hoover flags were pockets turned inside out to indicate emptiness. That's what the clip art indicates over there. And Hoover blankets were newspapers. This was a horrible, horrible time for individuals and families alike. And the fact that these things, Hoovervilles, Hoover flags, and Hoover blankets, all were named Hoover, really indicated the American disdain for their president and the fact that he was doing nothing to help them. So with the worst parts of culture, Hoovervilles, Hoover flags, and Hoover blankets reflecting the public distrust and dislike for President Hoover, you can imagine that he was about to face a really rough re-election campaign. It only got worse with the Bonus Expeditionary Force. So these were veterans of World War I. In 1924, Congress voted to give these veterans a delayed bonus, and it was to be paid in 1945. So, some 20 years later, they're going to get their pay. In 1931, during the Depression, Congress voted to go ahead and let those veterans borrow immediately up to 50% of the bonus that they were owed. They overruled Hoover's veto of it, so Hoover was against giving them loan access to their bonus money that was already delayed 20 years. So several thousand veterans demanded the entire bonus in 1932, and this group of veterans who came together to demand this bonus called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. The story gets even worse for Hoover from there. So the Bonus Expeditionary Force camped out in shanties, and they said that they'd stay there till 1945. So they're in Washington, D.C., and they're kind of protesting, but they're very peaceful about it. And they create shanties, Hoovervilles, and they even bring their families to live in these shanties. Chances are they would have been living in shanties wherever else they were anyway, so why not do it here for a cause? So Hoover called in the army, and General Douglas MacArthur's troops came into the shanty town, and they used tear gas to evacuate the veterans and their families from the shanties. Then they burned the shanties, and they drove all of the veterans out with bayonets and sabers. More than 100 people were injured in this, and 2 infants died from inhaling tear gas. Now, these veterans demanded to see Hoover, but he refused. Now, even though Hoover did not order MacArthur's attack on the veterans, his refusal to see the veterans after the fact meant that he shared the blame for the outcome of the attack on them. And he was easily defeated then at that point in the 1932 presidential election by Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR. I don't know if any of you know anyone who lived through the Great Depression, but if you do, and if there's someone you can still talk to, ask them what they thought about Hoover, or just ask them about Hoover in general. Hey, tell me about Hoover. See what they say. I can almost guarantee that anyone who lived through the Depression still will talk some smack about Hoover because he did nothing for these people. FDR, in his first 100 days, came in strong, and he wanted to give relief to the people. Now, let's make things clear up front. FDR did not stop the Great Depression. Some people will argue that he made it worse by public spending, but ultimately, he put relief in the hands of the people who needed it. He looked for more efficient relief measures. He created some public works programs, and just the sheer tone and manner of his inaugural address calmed people. He tried to strike down fear. This is when he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he offered help. The White House got 500,000 letters and telegrams following that inaugural address in support of FDR, people who were just saying thank you. Thank you for noticing. These people felt like finally someone was paying attention to them and their needs, and it was powerful. Another part of FDR's New Deal was fiscal stimulus. One of those things was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which would extend mortgage options to people who were facing foreclosure on their home loans. He also increased federal spending so that it actually exceeded federal income. But he said people were more important than balanced budgets at this particular moment. Roosevelt's strong point was his open-mindedness and willingness to try. He wasn't some sort of financial genius, and he knew it. He actually told his administration, we're going to try things. If they don't work, we'll stop, we'll try something else. He was all about trial and error and about getting relief to the people who needed it. So one of the other things he did, he ordered the nation's bank to close on March 5th for a 4-day holiday. He took the country off the gold standard, and then after the 4-day holiday, stable banks were allowed to reopen. That confirmed community support of the banks again. They started feeling like their institutions were more stable once the federal government had checked to make sure that they were actually stable enough to remain open. So I mentioned that the 4-day bank holiday restored consumer confidence, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation gave people a chance to save their homes. But as federal spending exceeded federal income, it showed that the government was putting the welfare of ordinary people above a balanced budget. That single-handedly increased consumer confidence so much because people felt like someone cared, and the fact that they felt like someone cared meant that they were willing to kind of buckle down and get through it too. Basically, FDR was forming a team. So out of all this money that the federal government sunk into getting the country out of the Great Depression, the largest portion went to jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, paid young men $30 a month to plant trees, build ranger stations, clear undergrowth, and restore historic battlefields. There are actually some cabins at Lake Catherine that the CCC built. Also, it created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, and that set aside $500 million for unemployment relief. Also at the time, the FDIC was established to create some oversight for banking institutions. Roosevelt realized that it wasn't just laborers who needed jobs, there were artisans who were out of work too. So the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, helped solve that problem. In this picture, WPA artists John Alata, Philip Reisman, and John Lamont work in a temporary studio at the American Museum of Natural History. They're painting murals commissioned for the lobby of the Arsenal building in Central Park. So creative work continued as well, which kept people practicing their craft and practicing their art. And there were also musicians and writers that were part of the WPA project, as well as photographers. So largely FDR had the public support, but there were people who were anti-FDR. One of those groups of people were the Liberty League. These were traditional politicians who accused FDR of regulating business once they were no longer in danger of losing their businesses themselves. So after their businesses were secure, they formed the Liberty League to fight government bureaucracy. And then on the left, there were some influential intellectuals, artists, journalists, academics, and trade union leaders who started to discuss the potential of socialism. And then we also had Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party leader, who represented American Marxists. He called the New Deal a utopian fraud. So there were neo-populists who opposed FDR. The neo-populists were the new populists. They represented generally the West and the South of the United States. Senator Huey Long, a Democrat of Louisiana, was one of these neo-populists. So as a Democrat in the Senate, he actually went in approving of FDR's New Deal program. But when he wanted to add something to that program, FDR thought it was kind of ridiculous. Long wanted to give each citizen $5,000 by taxing large incomes. So that idea actually appealed to a lot of people because most people at the time did not have large incomes. FDR just thought it wasn't a sustainable idea, though, so he opposed it. And when he opposed Long's idea, Long got angry. As Louisiana governor, Huey Long went to great lengths to carry out his own programs. He used intimidation, blackmail, and even kidnapping. So he was really offended that FDR would not go along with his idea for a federal program. Charles E. Coughlin was a radio priest from Michigan, and just like Huey Long, he was actually for the New Deal at first, but he changed his mind when FDR would not endorse inflationary measures to end the Depression, and he used his radio show to speak against FDR. Francis E. Townsend was a California doctor who was concerned about the elderly. He also opposed FDR because he couldn't get support for his idea, which would have given all people over 60 a stipend of $200 a month on condition that they retire immediately from their jobs and that they spend the money as they get it. Now, this idea obviously was supported by older people, but not the FDR administration. They felt like there were other programs in the works that would have helped the elderly. $200 a month does not sound like a lot right now, but back then it would have been a good deal of money. So while there were people against FDR and his New Deal, there were plenty more people for him. They kind of developed this Roosevelt Coalition. For the first time, it seemed that the federal government was actually being helpful to the average American. The Works Progress Administration helped writers, artists, and musicians, performers, dancers, actors. The National Youth Administration kept kids in school and gave them career prep. African Americans shared WPA and National Youth Administration work, and the admin supported civil rights, even though FDR kind of skirted the issues himself. So while FDR did not actively come out and support a civil rights movement, his administration did see the value in civil rights as a movement, and they created that kind of from within, because FDR knew he needed Southern votes, and Southerners would not support that kind of civil rights movement at that time. The labor movement grew stronger during FDR's presidency. The Wagner Act, approved in 1935, established a permanent National Labor Relations Board and gave it authority to supervise elections to determine whether workers in an industry supported union representation. This created a legal collective bargaining tool for union members. By the beginning of World War II, the entire auto industry was unionized. Social Security was part of the second 100 Days program. So in FDR's second term of office, the first 100 days, Social Security was one of the biggies that he addressed. It offered economic security for the elderly and was a collaborative effort between the state and federal governments. So, for all of those who said he was absorbing too much federally, this was actually a collaborative effort that included state involvement. And then FDR wanted to include healthcare in that as well, but he did not, simply because the American Medical Association started talking about it as socialized medicine. And if you think about it, we still have that argument today. During his second term of office, FDR went in with an idea of some must-achieve legislation. One of those was the Public Utility Holding Company Act that gave federal government control of interstate transmission of electricity and gas. And the Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, we still have REA businesses that supply electricity. Those were created to improve rural quality of life. And then also the Fraser-Lemke Farm Mortgage Moratorium Act extended mortgages for 3 years on farms to save foreclosures. FDR's popularity and the relief offered through his New Deals won him renomination for a third term to office. The second term limit, the 2-year term limit, didn't come about until 1951. So Roosevelt actually spent 4 terms in office. But here at the end of this chapter, we are ending with his 3rd term in office. He used fireside chats, which were radio broadcasts that kept him in touch with families. He was like with them in their homes, talking to them over the radio. It was like social media is today, except, they could hear his voice and they felt like he was talking to them. And these fireside chats really gave people the warm fuzzies and just kept that love for FDR going forward. The economy, however, failed to make a complete recovery. But people were saved at the expense of government. People finally felt like they were important. And at this particular time, people were valued more than the balanced budget. And at the end of this chapter, we start to see, and at the end of this decade, we start to see people are shifting their focus from what's going on here to watching the war overseas. And then finally, just wanted to throw in one last thing, a picture of FDR's visit to Malvern. Franklin Roosevelt visited Malvern on June 10th, 1936, and it was for the state's 100-year anniversary. This is the presidential motorcade working its way up Main Street, so that would be coming in from the viaduct into town. This is Miller's Drugstore in the lower right corner. And notice there's a beer sign next to it that shows that Hot Spring County was wet at the time. And the building on the lower left that says McLean is actually what is now 3rd and Main Suites, if you kind of need to put things into perspective. So you can see the motorcade, you can see that Malvernites lined the Main Street, which was paved especially for this visit.